Quake 2 was released on December 9th, 1997. Compared to the tumultuous development cycle of the first Quake, Quake 2's went pretty smoothly. Now, shame about the name though. Yeah, Quake 2 wasn't meant to be called that. The team at id went in a very different direction in tone and wanted to call the game something else. But when they couldn't decide on a better name, they settled on Quake 2, feeling that the gameplay of the game resembled Quake more than anything else. This is an odd one. I don't ever hear anyone talk about Quake 2. You'd think a sequel to a game as influential as Quake, even if only in name, and one that sold well over 1 million copies would at least get some mention from the more dedicated old school gamers. The only person I've been able to talk about it who had a solid opinion on it is one of my bitch friends, and he describes it as a tech demo more than a game. That sounds pretty bad, but many great games act as tech demos for new technology. Need I mention Quake 1 itself? So why don't we jump into it and find out if Quake 2 is simply underrated or best left forgotten. Oh, and for this review, I used a Yamagi Quake as my source port of choice. Quake 2 has completely forgone the Lovecraft horror of the first game. In its place is a decidedly science fiction based world. Humanity has been attacked by an alien force known as the Strogg, and to hit them back, have launched a counterattack on their own planet known as Stragos. You take control of a guy known as the Bitter Man, who was sent down with a platoon of troops to Stragos. While going towards the designated landing zone, another landing pod strikes Bitter Man's own and sends him spiraling away. Despite the seeming misfortune, Bitter Man getting knocked off course actually ends up saving him, as everyone who hit the designated landing zone was either killed or captured. As the sole survivor, Bitter Man is tasked with doing everything really, from shutting down supply lines to defense installations to eventually even offing the leader of the Strogg himself, the Macron. And that's Quake's plot. Despite the increased focus on it, it's really not any more complicated than the first game's plot, and as far as unique settings go, Quake 2 is not even close to being standout. All of the sci-fi in the game is unbelievably generic. The Strogg are the cookie-cutter warfaring species. They hit all the check marks of a science fiction hostile race. They're entirely dedicated to war. They torture and kill captured soldiers. They want to destroy humanity. All that shit's here. And it makes them incredibly one-note. Even the individual troops look pretty similar to one another. Compared to Quake's distinct house of horrors, it can be hard to tell who is who, and threat management can be much more difficult because of it. Stragos as a setting is also extremely boring. It uses the brown and imposing architecture of Quake, but it completely misses the context of it. It just makes the Strogg look like they don't ever pressure wash the place. And a lot of this could have been saved by an interesting villain, but you're not even told about who you're fighting until right at the end game. The Macron only becomes involved in the story at the end, where he teleports to an asteroid base to escape you. You track him down, and with a couple of quad damage BFG shots he croaks. You get onto an escape pod, shit blows up for no reason, and then you win. You don't even get a text crawl calling you the master of Quake or anything. You just get a thumbs up and an end screen practically from Tom and Jerry. Of course, like Quake, you don't play id games for the story, you play them for the gameplay, and Quake 2 is, first off, movement has been slowed down quite a bit, but a sprint button has been added. You can toggle always running the options, but I think the slower speed actually works for this game. Enemies are much more common in Quake 2 than in Quake 1, but are just as tanky. They're also placed in all sorts of small corners and crannies in every level. Hell, I see where Doom 3 gets the monster closets from. Running into every room is a very good way to get surrounded and gunned down in quick order. All your foes can pump out good damage, so staying near cover is more important than ever. Luckily, most of your weapons are of the long range variety. You start with the blaster. This thing is fucking garbage. It's basically the axe from Quake 1 but with range. It fires a hideously slow projectile that lights up the surrounding area. It does shit for damage though, but it at least has infinite ammo, assuming you'd ever want to pull it out after you find any other weapon. The shotgun and super shotgun return, of course. The shotgun is just as weak as Quake 1, and it has a much longer downtime between shots. It is actually worthless even against the basic mooks. The super shotgun, however, has been lucky to get buffed back into some usefulness. I wouldn't compare it to Doom 2's double barrel offering, but it can make good work of any of the basic enemies in a shot or two, and is a decent option until ammo for the stronger weapons becomes readily available. The nail gun has been replaced with the much more humdrum assault rifle. It keeps the good damage and makes the shots hit scan, but the accuracy leaves something to be desired, and it feels terrible to fire. Instead of the super nail gun, the chain gun makes a return from Doom with a hell of a firing rate upgrade. It takes a second to get going, but when it does, damn, it shreds. The grenade launcher and rocket launcher also return. And what the fuck happened to the grenade launcher? It has seen a nerf in firing speed, projectile speed, range, and even damage. The thing is worthless almost the moment you pick it up. And if it wasn't for the bouncing shots and high quantity of ammo available, it'd be completely useless. The rocket launcher, thankfully, hasn't seen so many nerfs, but its rockets do travel noticeably slower. Make sure you adjust accordingly. There are quite a few new additions, however. The weapon pool in Quake 2 is much more diverse than Quake 1. First off is throwable grenades. Just don't. They have a terrible tiny arc when thrown, and they don't even do enough damage to make up for it. They share ammo with the grenade launcher, so if you really want to lob grenades, just use that instead. You also have the Hyper Blaster. It's similar in function to the plasma gun from Doom. Good damage and surprisingly common ammo. The Hyper Blaster pretty much became my default weapon once I found it. It has an annoying stutter when you stop firing with it though. Like sometimes you can fire immediately after again, and sometimes you have to wait for the barrel to spin back into place. The next new addition is the railgun. It shoots a very powerful and accurate shot that pierces enemies. It pretty much deletes small fry from the battle. Ammo's not too hard to find for such a powerful weapon either, thanks to the commonness of the railgun carrying gladiator enemy. And finally, to round out the weapon collection is the BFG 10K. Not sure how it ended up here from Doom, but it brings some of its power to Quake 2. It's seen a pretty noticeable nerf to damage because it's not able to instantly delete small enemies anymore like the BFG could, but it's still a pretty good offering if you're willing to spare the ammo for it. And one more interesting thing is a sort of inventory system. You can press the tab key to check not only your currently held weapons in ammo form, but also the items you currently have. Old power-ups like quad damage and invincibility have had a repurposing of sorts. Rather than being placed all around levels to be used right when they're picked up, you can now hold on to them until later and use them at your own discretion. I actually really like this system. While I loved getting power-ups in Quake already, being able to hold on to them for any time I feel I need them is pretty dope, honestly. I always love changes like this that go towards giving the player more choices to make in a firefight. And it's important to reserve the items you find because unlike Quake 1, they're far less common to account for their increase in utility. It's both strategy and resource management, and that's pretty cool. Also cool is the new addition, Adrenaline. These rare pickups are found as another secret around the levels, and they give you 1 HP. It sounds lame, but that 1 hit point is actually an increase to your total base health. It might not be much on its own, but if you find a lot of them, you can always enter firefights with a nice cushion. A less welcome change, however, is the slowing of your weapons. Weapons in Quake 2 fire much slower than Quake, and the switch speed is so slow it's honestly frustrating. When you're in the heat of battle trying to reach the key 8 or whatever to change weapons, it's not easy to do. Speaking of weapons in firefights, Quake 2 has a number of different enemies to test your aim on. Not that they're very unique though, the Strogg match their homeworld and that most of them look the fucking same. You have a couple of different basic mooks, some flying enemies, a couple of big guys, and some even bigger guys. We even have some bosses to go around now. But despite having 18 regular enemies and 4 bosses to fight, the Strogg not only match each other in looks, but also how they act. Other than the type of weapon they have, all the enemies in Quake 2 will almost always make a beeline straight for you. When they're not getting stuck on the terrain, that is. Yeah, Quake 2's enemy AI is pretty poor. When they aren't attacking you, they're just walking straight towards your position. While it's true of most of id's games, I found it to be most noticeable in Quake 2. Mostly because the level design seems to be made just to fuck with their AI. You'll find plenty of instances where enemies can't reach you either because of hostile wall insets or because they're above or below you. And when this happens, they just start jerking around. It looks terrible. Another thing about some enemies is that when you shoot at them, they'll duck to go under some of your bullets. Now this could have been interesting if not for the fact that enemies not only do it a lot more than they should, but they're completely immobile and will not shoot a single shot at you no matter how close you get, or how much you punish them for being fucking defenseless. So not only are enemies in Quake 2 stupid, they're also exploitable, and that's a terrible combination, and that makes the Strogg just seem pathetic and stupid. It's honestly baffling that they've managed to survive this long. Oh, and on the note of levels, good God, what happened? Quake 2 is practically the opposite of level design from Quake. First I should mention, there isn't a hub area to select episodes like Quake. You don't even have level complete screens anymore. Instead you just enter transition areas to move to the next map. And other than some short scenes showing you moving through Stragos from a computer view, you don't even get any cutscenes during the game. You can also backtrack to older maps at many points, and this is where the issues start. There'll be plenty of times where you have to grab something from one map and backtrack to another. While this is fine in the early game when the maps are smaller and simpler, as the complexity ramps up, things get so bad. By the time I'd reached the mines area of the game, I found myself wandering around quite a bit more than I really should have. Because when things aren't looking the same in Quake 2, they're just being obtuse. I actually managed to sequence break during the power plant segment of the game. I was looking for the next dumbass button to press, and I made this jump right here. After doing that, I walked a bit further and I managed to find myself in the back part of one of the later levels. This exploration didn't last long though, mostly because this door, which turned out to be a blue key door from the front side. I mean, my god, it's less obtuse to break these levels than it is to play them normally. And really, if that doesn't tell you everything you need to know about Quake 2's levels, then I don't really know what will. Above all other id games, Quake 2 could have really benefited from a map system. While you can access an objective menu by pressing F1, it does not help nearly enough. It tells you what to do next, but not where the next thing is. Could it be on this map? Or maybe the last map? I don't know. And it took little time to become extremely frustrating. You can't even rely on the new enemies means you're going the right way idea, which it has used before, because there's some respawning enemies in Quake 2. So you'll go back to an old location and have new enemies to fight. Oh, and when you find the new locations, be prepared to deal with some unbelievably annoying enemy placement. Literally around every fucking corner there's some Strogg fuck to shoot at. It could be everything from the little mooks to the big fucks who can quickly bring your health towards zero. And when they aren't hidden in every ass crack of the planet, they're placed above you or in some other position that means they can shoot onto you with impunity. Well, it makes sense from a story standpoint. From a gameplay one, having all these high damage, high endurance enemies with this kind of placement is just tiring. Also, what is up with going down slopes in this game? Quake 1 had this problem a little bit, but it's so much more noticeable here. When you walk down slopes, you just kind of skip and fall down them, and it makes movement on them chaotic and uncontrollable. You can be in the middle of a firefight and have your main enemy be fucking sloped to ground. It makes this segment in the hangar area a bitch too. So easy to fall off the bridge and just die in the toxic water with no escape. And another thing not helping is just how dark these places are. The Strogg must have enhanced vision as part of their cybernetics, because the brightest Quake 2 gets is a cloudy day. And a lot of the times it's just a couple of steps above pitch black. Quake 1 also had this problem, but I found it to be a lot more frustrating here because enemies hidden in the dark are a lot more common in this game. On the note of looks, Quake 2 is pretty average. While the tech is fantastic for 1997 and it's really advanced, the aesthetics of everything else are just so generic. Nothing in Quake 2 speaks to me like the first game did. Rather than dark castles and strange evil worlds, you get power plants and warehouses. And everything is stained and brown. For as much shit Quake got for its color palette, not only was it in service to the world without making things bland, it also had more variety than Quake 2 does. The only thing I can say on the aesthetic end that was executed with full quality is the colored lighting. Quake 2 is at least nice enough to use all the colors it can, even if the main ones are yellow and orange. One thing that I can say that has fared pretty well is the soundtrack. Rather than our boy Trent Reznor, Sonic and Mayhem instead was brought onto the project to create new music, and the result was a more appropriate to the game soundtrack. Quake 2 forgoes the ambience of Quake completely for a metal soundtrack, and it's pretty solid. A big problem with the soundtrack though is the lack of variety. The songs are pretty short and the selection is tiny. There's so many repeats, and while I like the compositions, they get tiring after the 10th level I've heard them. I think a unique song or two for every section of the game would have gone a long way to making both the soundtrack and the game's levels feel less samey. And I also think looping them properly would have made the restarting less noticeable. Tracks just fade out and restart, and it's jarring as hell. You ever hear people that talk shit about 90s shooters? Saying that all of the 90s shooters are just massive confusing levels of enemy spam to get in the way of you finding keycards to open up doors for more keycards and enemies that shit with a too big arsenal of weapons? That's what Quake 2 is. It's the game that exemplifies the worst of 90s shooters. It has big confusing maps, it has a ton of annoying enemies spammed around, keycard hunts, badly hidden secrets, the whole deal. I honestly think you could even make an argument that Quake 2 is the end of the 90s shooter, because while it has all the worst parts, it also has a lot of design choices that outright go against classic shooters. You have a run button now, fights in general are much slower and more about hiding behind cover. You have an inventory system, and while these aren't necessarily bad things on their own, they don't really gel with the classical parts of Quake 2's design. I guess there's kind of a poetic thing there, really. The company that single-handedly created the best of the classic shooters is also the one to show them at their worst. And that was that, really. Not a year later, Half-Life was released to the gaming world, and the classic arena shooter was more or less finished. Slower speeds, reloading, and a greater emphasis on story was obviously what the gaming public wanted. No one was interested in flying through a disjointed set of levels looking for keycards and buttons for doors anymore. While Quake would continue on with a third game focused on multiplayer exclusively, Quake 2 would be the final single-player arena shooter from id Software. And I can see why nobody talks about Quake 2 anymore. While it's not an awful game, it's certainly one of the lowest ranking I've played from id Software. When it's not like aggravating with obtuse designs and lackluster weapons and enemies, it's just bland and boring. The game is a sight to behold of its technical engine achievements, but you can skip the rest of it.